Welcome back. This episode should be considered a continuation of my video FDR versus Biden, Putin and Hitler, Trump, historical comparison. In that video of February 7, I said that both Hitler and Putin have expansionist visions based on 19th century areas of influence, conceptions of foreign policy. I also said that Putin's economy is as addicted to war as Hitler's was starting in 1936. That turning back to normal an economy where 40% of public spending is dedicated to war, like the case of Russia, would imply a painful adjustment that might put Putin's political survival at risk. Now, 7 months after that video, let me say that such a diagnosis has been proven correct. So I am going to update it as a reaction to some articles published in Foreign Affairs and RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute. In Warnings from Weimar, Daniel Ziblatt details the mistakes made by German parties that made possible for Hitler to accumulate such power to end democracy in Germany. Mainstream political leaders had many opportunities to push back, but in the account made by Ziblatt, Hugenberg believed he could use Hitler to revitalize his conservative movement. Then von Papen believed he could control Hitler after making him chancellor. And then the Centrist Party leader Kass believed that capitulating to Hitler's demands would protect his party and buy time for a more significant resistance. And thus Ziblatt centers his analysis in domestic policy is perfectly possible to extrapolate it to foreign affairs. If you cave to the demands of tyrants like Hitler or Putin, new demands will follow, and most probably they will lead to war, not when you finally realize appeasement is futile, but at the moment of the tyrant's choosing. People like Chamberlain honestly believe that bullying Czechoslovakia into ceding territory in 1938, like many in Europe and the United States believe the same about Putin now with respect to Ukraine, would bring lasting peace. They only got a longer and bloodier war in 1939 instead. But who saw that already in 1938? FDR. That's why he used every trick in the book he could to help Churchill in 1940. Even before Lend-Lease in 1940, he used tricks like destroyers for bases. And he had to fight with the strong isolationism that permeated the United States since the end of World War I. Had he been guided by what today passes for foreign policy experts, he would have bullied England to make concessions to Hitler in order to end the Battle of Britain. And what makes the juncture more upsetting is that Trump shares Putin's 19th century vision of spheres of influence, where he sees himself reigning in one of these spheres, China in another one, and Putin in an area of influence that includes, yes, you bet right, Europe. Even when Europe has 10 times Russia's GDP and is part of NATO. If that's not the perfect recipe for a bloodier and longer war in the future, I don't know what is. In fact, some reports say that if Putin gets away with his demands on Ukraine, he could be ready to challenge Europe again in 7 years. though I am more inclined to believe that in Europe he will escalate his hybrid war, for instance, helping parties like Le Pen's for Reform UK in England and the AfD in Germany, and will reserve his military power to the areas of Africa and Asia where China has economic interests that require an enforcer, like Afghanistan, where Russia's Africa Corps will provide China the security it needs to exploit the Afghan lithium. In Alexander Gabweb's Putin's Play for Time, the author notices that Putin's strategy is to outlast Ukraine militarily and economically. So let's focus for now in the military aspect. It's true that Russia has shown progress adapting to Ukraine's tactics and in hardware issues like fiber optic drones and hypersonic missiles, which travel 5 times the speed of sound. Yet, when it comes to its soldiers, it still relies, like Stalin, in waves of soldiers barely trained as cannon fodder, whose role is to expose the location of Ukrainian positions so the rest of the Russian infantry and artillery can target them more accurately. Yet, this tactic is costly in terms of casualties, and Putin, who has relied on voluntary conscripts among the poor and from rural areas, is being pushed precisely by this tactic to implement mandatory drafts that target Russian cities, something he has avoided so far despite having 4 times the number of fighting age men that, than Ukraine has, to the point that he has preferred to use North Koreans instead of implementing a mandatory draft in Russian cities. Denga Web gives us an example of what Europe could do to fund the kind of increase in drones and artillery production it needs to get Putin in trouble, considering that the Russian economy, despite Putin's massive spending in defense, is showing signs of slowing down. And this is seizing the 250 billion of frozen Russian assets in Europe. Let's make a precision here. This number has been disputed multiple times because, as incredible as it sounds, to this day we don't know the exact amount. But anyway, in other words, if Russia is having economic problems, the idea would be to force it to spend more in defense or cut its losses in Ukraine, right? Well, no, despite counting with sound legal basis since September 17, 2023, to seize the Russian reserves in Europe, Brussels, despite the fiscal problems in France, Germany, and the UK, is still making excuses. In all but a small loan that is a more symbolic step that is laughable considering that Putin is throwing the kitchen sink on Ukraine as his economy his central bank has got to cut interest rates for the second time to prevent a recession, of course. The decrease in oil and gas revenues is already affecting the war economy, Putin's war economy. Some of the Russian regions that previously offered lavish payouts for military recruits are reducing sign-up bonuses because funds are drying up. The most visible sign of this is the country's ballooning budget deficit. At the beginning of this year, the Kremlin's plan was to have a budget deficit of just 0.5% of the country's GDP. Yet in June, the Kremlin had to increase that to 1.8% of GDP. But it seems it will overshoot even this target. In the first 7 months of this year, the budget deficit already amounted to 2.2% of GDP. More US sanctions could also prove useful, as such a move would put significant pressure on the Kremlin's cash flow. As Alexandra Prokopenko wrote in Foreign Affairs in January, the Russian economy has enough steam to support Putin's war machine for another 18 to 24 months. But the situation is worsening, and Russia's welfare fund is almost exhausted. So if GDP, if Europe, let's be honest, Europe cannot count on the United States, at least for now. But Europe has 10 times Russia's GDP. If Europe cannot use that leverage, then we are lost. Precisely because Putin's economy is weakened, the wise movement would be to push the Kremlin's finances against the ropes, and yet we still don't see enough signs of that. Some progress, but not enough. Yet Putin, despite throwing the kitchen sink over Pokrovsk, still clings to his maximalist demands because he doesn't fear, for instance, serious sanctions. After 17 rounds of sanctions, with many loopholes unenforced and relying on affidavits, Europe has still not abandoned an absurd gradualism that has only given Moscow time to adapt. Not to mention that to this day, Europe keeps buying LNG gas and metals from Russia. Not to mention that Turkey, to the last I knew, was blending Russians Euro blend with theirs to resell that to Europe. Not to mention the cases of countries that has been willing accomplices of Moscow to bypass the sanctions on imports, like Kazakhstan. Not to mention many other examples of how these sanctions have been, these 17 and now 18 rounds of sanctions have been more a declaration than an actual tool to tame Russia. Moreover, all available polling shows that Ukraine's society will not accept the country's territory being traded, and from the military perspective, surrendering the Western Donbass would amount to giving the invader the key to all of northern and central Ukraine. Therefore, pushing Zelensky to a premature peace would force him, as a referendum would be needed to amend the constitution. Otherwise, he would not be able to cede territory to Putin. So, in a bizarre turn of events that would put Zelensky in the bizarre position of campaigning after more than 3 years of war for the opposite he had championed at the cost of Ukrainian blood and treasury. If that's not a recipe for destabilization, nothing is. It would be the perfect prelude for Putin to apply the Georgian model. The cost for Europe would be huge too. The alliance is intimately, tightly involved in building and testing weapons with Ukraine, training its army, and supplying it with intelligence and arms, including ones that can strike deep inside Russian territory. All that would be lost if Putin turns Ukraine into Belarus. And with Ukraine, any credible overhaul of Europe's defense procurement overhaul would be gone too. At least that's the position of Jack Watling, which I share. Therefore, according to Gabweb, and I agree, there are tools Europe can use, especially when the Russian economy may become an obstacle for Putin's plans, in about 12 to 48 months. And yes, the top powers in Europe are going through hard fiscal problems, but economically, not in fiscal terms, but economically, Europe has a leverage that could overwhelm Russia if they have the will to use it. Then we have Michael Kimmage, the article The Pernicious Spectacle of Trump's Russia-Ukraine Diplomacy. Here the author notes that Trump's Ukraine policy, by weakening Ukraine, weakens also the standing of the United States. Unfortunately, this is correct but irrelevant for Trump, who, as mentioned before, aligns himself more with Putin's 19th century concept of spheres of influence than with rules-based system championed by the United States since the end of the Second World War. Then the author correctly says that Putin's goal is not the Donbass, but Kiev. Nevertheless, he fails to acknowledge what Chancellor Merz has already realized, that Europe can't count on the United States, which leaves Europe alone. Yet Europe is still found wanting, since it seems more eagerly inclined to damn Ukraine with the best possible peace terms, so forgetting that after taking the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia with European support in 1938, Hitler, took the rest of the country in 1939. Is this maybe the reason why Zelensky is going along with the European charade of begging Trump his mediation in a ceasefire we all know Russia won't respect? Is this a sign that Zelensky, distrusts the many times his partners, considering the many times Europe has proven to be an unreliable partner, and knowing well that Finlandization is not an option? It's hard to know. And as you know, even though I support Zelensky, it's hard for me to see him in this tragic spot when he has to go along with the bad, just hoping for the best. Besides, if Putin destabilizes Kiev, an insurgency won't be an option. Just remember the Second Chechen War. Putin or the intervention in Syria. So, in other words, do you believe Putin is going to take into account human rights when it comes to suffocating an Ukrainian insurgency? No. If there is something he won't allow after all this war, is that the second Yanukovych be deposed by a Maidan revolution as the first Yanukovych was. Then Kimmage notes two fundamental issues. The first of them is that Europe is failing at explaining the war to its population, that we are repeating 1938, which of course makes for the advocates of appeasement easier to sell their counterproductive point. The other fundamental issue that noted by Kimmage is that these ridiculous distractions that fascinated the mass media, like Putin's and Trump's meetings, even though we already know how they are going to end, distract public opinion from what really matters for peace. The need for a faster progress in Europe towards a consolidation of its fragmented and inefficient defense industry, and the little progress at ramping artillery and drone production, despite Europe having 10 times Russia's GDP. And the best proof of this is that after more than 3.5 years of war, Ukrainians are still outgunned in Pokrovsk. Finally, we have Jack Watling's article, Ukraine, a European Vision of Victory. So to end this video, let me here summarize the main points of this article as follows. Number one, Russia represents a clear danger for Europe as Putin's goal of implementing a 19th century vision of spheres of influence, which Trump shares, collides with Europe's goals, and actually with Europe as we know it. And the sooner they realize they are on their own, the sooner they should stop courting Trump and start explaining this war to its population. That also would help to counter the advance of the far right that is sponsored by Putin. The cases we have mentioned of Reform UK, the Le Pen's party, and Alternative for Deutschland. A vision of victory is still possible, yes, but that window of opportunity, as noted by Watling, is closing, and it may be closing in as soon as 7 years, time in which Putin can regenerate most of its hardware losses in Ukraine. Number two, as Jack Watling explains, if Ukraine can hold on for another year, continuing to attract Russian forces, however, then Russia may be pushed beyond its ability to readily recover. Russia is already approaching the exhaustion of its stockpile Soviet-era armored vehicles by the end of 2025. In 2026, the Russian army will have to replace losses by producing new equipment. The Russian army will have to replace losses by producing new equipment. Recruitment is currently at an all-time high in Russia, with between 35,000 to 47,000 people joining the army, the military per month. But the bonuses needed to induce enlistment have peaked, while much of the enthusiasm to join has been driven by a perception that the war will soon be over. To keep up recruitment, Russia is already looking beyond voluntary enlistment. Russia cannot further increase payments, as the Kremlin has emphasized that it will not be spending more on defense. If the war looks to be protracting, it will struggle to keep up the rate of recruitment. In terms of both equipment and personnel, the key to Russia's ability to rebuild combat power is money, which is overwhelmingly generated through the oil and gas sector. Thus, considering how reluctant Europe is to deploy soldiers, it should be happy of counting with Ukraine's willing to fight, and different from Gabweb, Watling estimates that in as soon as 1 year, the pace of the war may force Putin to either cut his losses in Ukraine or inflict severe pain into Russians, which he has fiercely avoided so far. Number three, after this, Watling gives us one example on where sanctions in order to weaken Russia economically can be improved. Most of Russia's oil exports are moved by sea, and over 60% of that traffic flows through the Baltic Sea, where they must pass through the Danish waters. Another way of hurting Russia economically would be helping Ukrainians to target Russian infrastructure, effort that would have to rely on European and Ukrainian missiles and drones, since the Pentagon, no surprise, has again blocked that option, at least for the weapons used by Ukraine that are made in the United States. Number 4, finally, the second condition Watling sees for Europe to be able to counter the Russian threat is that Ukraine doesn't fall. In the short term, Europe can and must cover most of Ukraine's needs, so long as it can purchase some critical weapons types that from the United States and invest in Ukrainian military production, which, as we have seen in crops, is still from correcting the European inclination to make empty pledges. Like in 2023, when it pledged 1 million artillery shells and delivered only 300,000, numbers that improve only marginally in 2024. However, in the medium term, Europe must address fundamental weaknesses in its defense industrial base. For instance, investment in explosives and propellant production, for instance, is essential. Let's remember that currently Europe has only one TNT factory in Poland. Therefore, my analysis of February 7 stands as the 9 questions for which I demanded for more visibility in May 28. And yes, it's as if in 1940, FDR had been pressuring Churchill to make concessions to Hitler, despite the clear evidence that the 1938 appeasement had failed, and we don't seem to realize it. Mass media doesn't seem to realize it, so the people, the average man, cannot connect the dots the right way. And yes, we are repeating history, and that mediocre, lazy approach might take us to the worst case scenario, where we end up waging war like Europe in 1939, but not with Putin in Ukraine, but with Putin and Xi, whether in Ukraine or somewhere else. And having said that, thank you.
And now, an important message from the Democratic Party.
It's going to hurt every American. It's going to hurt the kids at the universities who've had nothing to do with protesting. But it's also going to hurt the kind of medical research and other kinds of great research that is done at Harvard and other universities. So we sent him a very strong letter just the other day, asking 8 very strong questions about why this isn't just a pretext.
Well, you'll let us know if you get a response to that letter. I do want to say, you said you hope that
I will.
This is that this